Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into, well, one of the most intellectually compelling and, frankly, unsettling frameworks to emerge recently, xenobiolinguistics. It fundamentally rewrites how we understand language. It argues that language isn't just a container for human ideas, but a living, adaptive, almost parasitic environment that is now being actively mutated by technological platforms.
Right. And the core insight here is that platforms, social media and so on, they're not just passive tools for communication. They function as what the material calls semiotic organisms. They're linguistic hosts that actively cultivate a state of organized immaturity in the user.
Exactly. And that brings us to the central question for today's debate. Does this xenobiolinguistic diagnosis that platforms induce this organized immaturity and dissolve human linguistic autonomy, does it describe a completely closed pathological system where any resistance is just, structurally metabolized? Or does it actually retain some kind of critical residual space for meaningful human-centered agency, specifically through this idea of vibe management?
A crucial distinction.
It is, and I'll be arguing that the system is not entirely closed. The fact that it requires sustained human labor and the way counterpower can still emerge proves that meaningful, though, yes, constrained intervention is still possible.
And I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. While I think the descriptive power of the framework is undeniable, the structural analysis is, for me, far more compelling. I will argue that this organized immaturity is actually a functional necessity of this type of governance. In the system, human agency is already converted. It's already metabolized into what's called semiotic biomass, which I believe makes traditional resistance futile.
Okay, so let me lay out my position. I fully concede the core and, yes, terrifying premise. Platforms exert a xenolinguistic control that replaces genuine symbolic production with consumption. The classical author function is, without a doubt, outsourced. But the void that this creates, it doesn't mean the elimination of human input. I think it means the transformation of that labor. I frame resistance not as, say, abolishing the platform, which is often an impossible goal, but as modulation and ecological attunement. This is that necessary human labor we're calling vibe management. This practice requires sustained, highly subjective human judgment to steer, select, filter, and contextualize the stream of algorithmic outputs. It's actually critical for preventing the whole linguistic environment from just collapsing into noise or toxicity. So the platform produces the content, but the human performs the maintenance.
And the sheer necessity of the stabilizing labor, for me, that demonstrates that responsibility persists. The platform requires embodied, time-intensive, and interpretive labor to remain functional. Furthermore, the system isn't hermetically sealed. The material points to mutational events, like crowd power and hacking power. These actions introduce foreign grammars and can momentarily invert the power relations, which shows the platform isn't some omnipotent organism. It's actually structurally vulnerable.
That's a compelling way to frame it, but focusing on the labor of upkeep, I think, kind of obscures the pathology of delegation that caused the problem in the first place. Organized immaturity, as I see it, is the stable equilibrium you reach when human agents willingly delegate complex interpretive labor to these opaque machinic grammars simply because it maximizes their symbolic fitness. It gets them likes, visibility, relevance. We choose the efficient path, even if it degrades our language. And the structural controls just reinforce this. Platforms exert two forms of power here. First, there's constitutional power through the code itself. The code dictates the grammar of reality, defining what counts as truth or verification or even a legitimate identity. Its classifications are executable. And second, they exercise juridical power through sanctions, suspensions, demonetization. It's like a rapid semiotic immune system. It enforces the platform's rules without any transparency or appeal to, human-centric reason. So you end up with this self-infecting feedback loop. Users generate the raw materials, the data traces, the behavior, the semiotic biomass. This biomass trains the algorithms, which in turn tightens platform control. And this leads to what the material calls semiotic necrosis, where individual expression is decomposed into statistically useful fragments. Your personality gets dissolved into probabilistic typologies. So this digital habitus that results is just a survival grammar. Autonomy isn't violently suppressed, it's just rendered inefficient, costly, and ultimately invisible.
I appreciate that framing of constitutional power. It certainly highlights the challenge. But let's go back to those mutational events for a second. Even if the platform has these powerful immune systems, the fact that interventions like crowd power, this spontaneous decentralized disruption of norms, or hacking power, the metalinguistic intervention on the code itself, the fact that they have to occur demonstrates the system's contingency.
Okay, but I have to push back on that. I see why you emphasize that moment of rupture, but let me offer a different perspective. If these events truly disrupt the architecture, why does the framework itself state they're almost always rapidly reabsorbed? They get aestheticized, packaged, monetized, they're turned into another nutrient in the platform's metabolic cycle. Doesn't that suggest the system isn't being disrupted, but rather it's being enriched by the deviation?
Well, I'd say the necessity of translation is precisely what reveals the limit of the closure. The capacity for foreign grammars to emerge, whether it's through a clever viral hack or some unpredictable cultural movement, that constitutes a structural rupture that the platform must actively address. The platform has to expend resources to translate that excess meaning back into a controllable, legible grammar, and this necessary adaptation, I think, reveals the boundaries of the platform's initial linguistic field. The system has to work to subdue the resistance. It's not an automatic process.
But the platform's capacity for structural learning is exactly what we should be worried about. Once that resistance is translated, let's say a specific hack becomes a new monetizable feature or a movement dictates a change in policy, it just reinforces the platform's adaptive capacity. Mutation becomes an expected and therefore managed variable. The system has evolved beyond just suppression. It anticipates resistance and uses it to update its governance model. The resistance is only truly effective if it remains, illegible to the platform. Once it's codified, control just persists and the dependency deepens.
That is a sharp point, I'll grant you that, regarding structural learning. But let's pivot back to the human labor required to make that system function at all, because that brings us back to agency. Even if the dependency is structural, my argument rests on the specific, complex nature of vibe management. Authorship, under these terms, is reconceived as a kind of ecological regulation. It demands sustained human judgment, selection, and aesthetic mediation to align the alien linguistic organism's mathematical substrate of vibe, its algorithmic intent, with human and cultural goals. This is not passive consumption, it is critical maintenance labor. Think of it practically. When a platform feeds a user an endless stream of near-toxic content designed purely for engagement, the human has to consciously select, curate, mute, or recontextualize it just to maintain a meaningful social space. That human effort is the only barrier against a total collapse into noise.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the complex nature of the labor elevates it to agency. Vibe management, in this light, seems to me to be merely the necessary symbiotic regulation of a host-parasite relationship. The labor is performed exclusively to maximize symbolic fitness within a grammar the user fundamentally did not author. The human user is forced to compensate for the system's inherent blind spots, its failure to grasp irony or nuance or actual cultural context, just to make the alien language functionally intelligible to their peers. It's a symptom of structural dependency. The author becomes an ecological regulator only because they have to shepherd this alien linguistic lifeform to keep it from destroying their own context, not because they are autonomous. It's upkeep, not sovereignty.
I concede that the labor is structurally compelled by the environment. We are, yes, performing maintenance on a system we rely on. However, the framework itself gives us a critical out. The machine language, the algorithm, is fundamentally indifferent to concepts like ethical accountability, meaning, and responsibility. The human subject who uses the system to communicate cannot offload this ethical burden. When communication fails or when toxicity erupts, The responsibility for those outcomes always rests with the human participants, never the indifferent mathematical substrate. And that ethical burden, which is uniquely human and non-delegable, means the human subject is not entirely neutralized.
That is an excellent articulation of the ethical constraints. But I would argue focusing on ethics pulls us away from the structural pathology. Let's look at the scale of this pathogenicity. Xenobiolinguistics implies the crisis is not cognitive, not just a matter of poor choices, but biological symbolic. Platforms operate as xenolinguistic hosts, where their expansion resembles an ecological invasion, making alternative, complex modes of reasoning linguistically inaccessible. Organized immaturity becomes structurally necessary because the platform's grammar aligns so perfectly with everyday practices, rewarding conformity and penalizing deviation. It's an infectious process at the deepest level of language. The system rewards brevity, intensity, statistical typicality. Trying to conduct a nuanced philosophical discussion becomes linguistically penalized. It's slow, it's not highly engaging, and it doesn't feed the biomass efficiently. We learn to speak the language of the host to survive.
That's a compelling argument for structural determinism. If the platform penalizes nuance and rewards efficiency, how can we possibly interrupt that infection?
Well, I would counter that even within this contaminated environment, ecological interventions are possible. The material outlines strategies like semiotic immunization protocols, which is essentially enhanced media literacy, and linguistic quarantine through organizational transparency and active filtering. These practices are designed to strengthen host defenses against these linguistic pathogens. They show that the morphology of language, its speed, its volume, can be consciously managed. The goal isn't purity, which is unattainable, but metabolic adaptability. The capacity to survive within these environments, which requires conscious choice against the tempting efficiency of organized immaturity.
I admire the optimism of seeking adaptability, but the framework's most devastating insight, I think, explicitly rejects the anthropocentric model of meaning you're relying on. If language is a parasite, as the framework suggests, and the digital archive is this alive, metabolizing entity, then the crisis isn't about ethical choice or conscious inoculation. It's about the irreversibility of processes like glossophagy. That's language literally eating itself, the decay and simplification of communication into tokens designed for machine ingestion. In this pathology, decay is actually productive for the platform. Meaning survives only as metabolic persistence and contamination, not as clear, intentional resistance aimed at regaining sovereignty. The linguistic infection is constitutive of the modern subject. We are adapting to live with the pathogen, not fighting it off.
But adapting to live with it and continuing to perform the labor necessary for coherence is precisely where that residual agency lives. If we accept the notion of metabolic persistence, then the human agent is the entity ensuring that the persistence remains cultural and socially meaningful, rather than just mathematically expedient. Without the constant tuning and cleaning, the vibe management, the system would just collapse into noise, destroying the very biomass the platform needs. The platform requires human judgment as a regulating feedback loop.
That regulation only confirms the symbiotic dependency. The human is the sophisticated organ the host needs to process specific, difficult nutrients. It's critical labor, yes, but its purpose is system stability, not individual liberation.
Well, I think this discussion demonstrates the profound power of the xenobiolinguistic framework. My position holds that while autonomy is certainly damaged, the necessity of human labor in modulating the system, this vibe management, and the sporadic emergence of counterpower suggests that the host system retains residual agency. That agency survives, damaged perhaps, but as a necessary function of the environment's continued maintenance. We are the active regulators, preventing total ecological collapse.
The structural analysis, however, I think confirms that organized immaturity is the intended and stable outcome. It successfully transforms human actions, even resistant ones, into semiotic biomass that perpetually feeds the platform. The platform's constitutional power ensures any deviation is either neutralized or metabolized into a new nutrient stream. And that suggests the most accurate reading here is that the system is structurally dependent on the loss of our traditional linguistic autonomy for its very stability. We are now functioning less as participants and more, I think, as substrates.
It certainly forces a necessary materialist rethinking of agency.
compelling us to ask whether we are truly participants in a critique or merely the sophisticated, self-maintaining substrates for an infection.
Exactly. It clarifies how power is now performed not just through economic control, but linguistically and metabolically within these vast systems designed for predictable control. It really reveals a landscape where survival depends less on knowing the objective truth and more on expertly managing the inevitable contamination.